Um, well, welcome everyone. And um, I'm just going to give a brief introduction now, and I'd like to begin with a meditation. So thank you, Julie, very much for your kind introduction. And perhaps I'll just offer a couple of quotes then uh, into our space, and then we'll have a short arriving grounding meditation. The poet Rilke says, "I have faith in nights." And a 19th century Hasidic Rebbe, the Kotzker Rebbe, rabbi, said, "There is no heart more whole than a broken one." And I also want to acknowledge all of you for being here today and your willingness to be with grief and to speak of grief, to honor grief. And I think, of course, as we move through this conversation and mourning together, a willingness to feel grief. And so we will focus on sudden loss, but I also want to acknowledge that all loss can feel sudden. And our conversation today is relevant just more generally, of course, to the experience of death and loss. And so we'll begin again with a small meditation. And if anything I suggest is not comfortable for you, then please just leave it aside and rest in a way that does feel comfortable for you. So taking a moment then, you can allow your gaze to rest in a lowered way, or even close your eyes. And just take a few deeper breaths, allowing your out breath to be slow and a bit extended. And on the out breath, feeling yourself drop down and settle more deeply in your body. Feeling yourself land against your seat, that contact between your sits bones and your seat beneath you, perhaps your feet on the floor. And then bringing your awareness to the sensation of breath, to the natural movement, the rhythm of your breath, without changing or shifting your natural breathing pattern. Just rest for a moment with the breath and also allow your awareness to be open, your senses awake and open to the space around you. Feeling the air against your skin, noticing sound, and taking a moment also to bring your attention to your inner landscape. Noticing what you carry with you today. What's alive in your heart space, the feelings, the mood, and just offering space to what's here for you. Staying with the breath, the ground of your seat, and a quality of acceptance and allowing. And as we move into our program, and I'd like to name specifically that this is a safe place to be with grief, to be with what's here for us, to share and to receive. And so then I welcome you. It feels significant to name that this is a safe place to receive or experience grief, vulnerability, because we live in a larger grief denying, grief phobic culture. Our world tells us that we should recover from our loss, that we should move on in our lives. And the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual used to identify mental disorders, identifies pathological grief as a mental disorder if there are significant symptoms of grief that persist for more than 1 year. There's a concept then when someone is no longer grieving, then they're better and they can go on and resume their normal lives. I don't think it works that way. I don't think we're meant to transcend or separate from or fix an experience that's a natural part of human life. We see grief as something to overcome, to fix, rather than something to tend and support. And so consequently, we can feel alone in our grief, afraid to share, because we feel that no one wants to hear of our pain. Megan Devine, and I work with her quite a bit, she wrote a wonderful book called It's Okay to, let's see, I have it right here. It's okay that you're not okay. Meeting grief and loss in a culture that does not understand. She says if we want to care for one another better, we have to rehumanize grief. We have to talk about it. We have to understand grief as a natural, normal process rather than something to be shunned, rushed through, or maligned. There's nothing wrong with grief. It's a natural extension of love. It is a healthy and sane response to loss. Grief has its own life and it will move through our experience in its own way. Megan says, again, some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried. They can be integrated and metabolized over time, becoming part of a whole, authentic human life. So I was invited this morning specifically to address the topic of sudden loss, out of order loss, traumatic loss that upends our lives, our world, our sense of a natural order in the universe. There are myriad kinds of sudden loss: accidents, cardiac event, a stroke or aneurysm. There are overdoses. People end their own lives. Experiencing sudden loss has qualities of shock and trauma that impact us physically. Grief is a full body, full mind experience. You're not just missing the person you've lost, your entire physiology is also reacting. There are studies in neurobiology that show that losing someone close to us changes our biochemistry. There are actual reasons for our insomnia, exhaustion, and racing hearts. Respiration, heart rate, and nervous system response are all partially regulated by close contact with familiar people and animals. And these brain functions are all deeply affected when we lose someone who is close to us. And then on this note, I do want to specifically name suicide, such a traumatic form of loss that's also stigmatized by our society. Suicide, by definition, really leaves us with complicated grief. We can have guilt, there are unanswered questions, we can have perseverating thoughts. B.J. Miller, the palliative care physician who directed the Zen Hospice project for many years and is a voice, a speaker around topics of death, dying, grief, he lost his own sister to suicide. And he says very movingly, suicide is just another way to die. And I just also wanted to share in my own community, my very close community, we experienced the loss of a dear friend this year who took his own life. And another friend received this text from a close friend of hers who had lost her husband when he took his own life some years ago. And this woman said, "It's a different kind of loss when the one you love stops living." I think that's the kindest way to phrase what happened, and it lends itself to a better understanding than the most common word that people use. Some of the most wonderful people to grace this earth have to stop living when the pain is too great. But it doesn't change who they were or who they are. It does not define them. She added, "My loving thoughts for strength are with all of you." And then Irvin Yalom, who's an existential psychologist, he says, "The pain is there. When we close one door on it, it knocks to come in somewhere else." Or as the poet Rumi says, "Some torn places cannot be patched." So recovery in grief is not about moving on. It's not about resilience or a return to a normal life. Megan Devine again writes very movingly. She said, "Recovery is about listening to your wounds. Recovery is being honest about the state of your own devastation. It's about cultivating patience, not the kind that implies waiting it out until you return to normal, but patience in knowing that grief and loss will carve their way through you, changing you, making their own kind of beauty in their own ways." And Rachel Naomi Remen, the physician who also works with bereavement and people who have terminal cancer diagnoses, she says healing or becoming whole is not about eradicating our wounds and weaknesses. It emerges in and through them. And then I thought I would share some words from an email I received from a dear friend whose partner took his life just a few weeks earlier. He said, "Specifically, as I move forward and learn to navigate this new world without Ilan physically by my side, I'm not imagining that at present I have before me anything more real or important than this pulsing of grief. I think and feel it would be very important and helpful to have someone to work with, a spiritual guide or friend, someone to witness and accompany me as I assimilate the impact of our loss, to help me unpack and observe and wonder and explore perspectives on what happened and what is happening. And beyond that, someone to help me as I continue to seek and build meaning and purpose with my life, to help me clarify and be awake and present and courageous." Is that asking too much? So I was so touched by his words and the wholeheartedness, the willingness, the whole being willingness to turn towards this grief and loss. And then Eve Marco, who's a wonderful Zen teacher, the wife of the teacher Roshi Bernie Glassman, who she also lost. She said, "When he left this world, it was as if fun and laughter left with him. I realized that I had to be responsible for my own joy now. It's what happens when a partner goes. You realize that, like in football, he played a particular position. If you want the game to go on, you have to cover that position yourself now, or at least find others around you to do this." And it brings me to there's a neuroscience scientist, Mary Frances O'Connor. She wrote a book called The Grieving Brain. And I heard an interview with her, and she beautifully identified two dimensions of grief that we navigate. We're very much aware of the dimension of personal loss and devastation, the loss itself, the hole that leaves in our lives, and the loss of who we were in that relationship, of our shared history, the loss of future that we might have shared together, that we visioned. And so that's all in the dimension of personal loss. But she describes a second dimension of grief, which is about rebuilding, revisioning, recreating our lives in the absence of this person who was so important to us. And that these two dimensions of grief, the loss itself and the rebuilding, recreating, exist side by side, and that we sometimes oscillate between them, but they're each overwhelming challenges as we navigate this territory of loss. And Joanne Cacciatore, who wrote a book, Bearing the Unbearable, she says, if we talk about recovery from loss as a process of integration, of living alongside grief instead of overcoming it, then we can begin to talk about what might help you survive. That's the real work of grief recovery, finding ways to live alongside your loss. She says, fully inhabiting painful feelings helps us to adjust to and accommodate them, find a way to live with them. The more we practice staying with the emotions that we think may overcome us, the more we can trust our ability to fully inhabit our grief. The more we inhabit it, the more comfortable we are staying and allowing it to move through us. She said it's a feedback loop that perpetuates self-regard, self-trust, self-compassion, and an acceptance of our genuine feelings. She says this way of being in the world becomes the crucible, a holding space or container for grief, however it shows up in each moment. And so then we seek people who can stand with us inside of our grief, who can come alongside us and not have judgments, not have a need to fix or change. We can sense that often people's instinctive need to cheer us up, or our own need to cheer up others who are in places of suffering, to be reassuring, to express positive aspects of their experience, come from our own or others' inability to stay and be with the pain of grief. And so I think it's Megan Devine says, the kindest thing we can do for someone in a state of emotional pain is to allow them to have their pain, to be with their pain. And so then we seek community where we can be honest, express what we carry, tell the truth about our experience, and just be received with no judgment, with no advice, with no counsel, but with a loving, compassionate, open presence. So there are also ways, perhaps actually I'm going to pause here. I can go into other aspects of traumatic grief responding. Maybe I'll just say a word before I pause, because it's such a vivid part of our experience in acute grief, and also I think just in life, is to experience anxiety. And so we can understand that anxiety is a brain-based nervous system response to imagined danger. It's not logical, it's biological. And so conscious breathing can help to soothe our nervous system. Lengthening your exhale, as we did initially in our meditation, it actually physiologically lowers our heart rate, lowers our blood pressure. Conscious breathing can help us feel our bodies, help us feel the earth beneath us, help us ground. And when we come into our bodies, when we're grounded and present, we can bear witness to and honor our grief. Becoming present gives us access to our own experience, to our thoughts and feelings. It can allow our experience to be felt and known. The wisdom I'm aware of around grief has to do with deeply and fully feeling our grief. And that when we feel our grief, when we offer space to our own experience, then it gives this space for that experience to move, to be metabolized, to integrate. We do need support to stay present with overwhelming, painful feelings. So that might be a therapist or a trusted friend. We might speak or share our grief with an animal, a pet, in the forest, by the ocean. But understanding that the imprint of powerful experience, the impression, needs expression is a key point in the metabolizing and integrating of powerful experience. And so then, just in very essential ways, the counsel to care for our physical organism. If we're in a state of great emotional suffering, maybe nothing's going to make that better right now, but it can give us a ground of greater support if we find some way to rest, to eat, to move. Find some way. This also works with anxiety to trust ourselves and remind ourselves, I can meet this moment. I can meet this moment. And I know how to ask for help, to reach out for support if I feel overwhelmed or need more presence. And it also meets anxiety to tell the truth to ourselves. I'm afraid, I feel anxious, I'm overwhelmed. And to name our experience, I'm feeling such intense grief, I'm feeling such intense yearning, that naming our experience also lessens our anxiety. And we can ask ourselves, it's a really key question, whether we're in acute grief or again, just in our daily experience. What do I need right now? And how can I best meet that need? It's often a need for connection, for reassurance, for stability. And so ideally, we can come to ourselves, especially the anxious, fearful, terrified parts of ourselves, with love and respect. So moving into healing practices. Again, Joanne Cacciatore, who wrote the book Bearing the Unbearable, she has an amazing list of healing practices in her book. I highly, highly recommend both her book and Megan Devine's books. And she speaks of micro rituals, practices that are intentional ways of invoking our beloved dead, those we've lost, invoking their presence in our daily lives. And she says they're just tiny practices that carve out spaces in regular life that's specifically for touching our loved ones who have died. And so there's the man who said, "Good morning, Pop," every morning when he sat down to have breakfast. For me, anytime I tip someone at a restaurant now, so many businesses have a little tip jar. My dad was a very generous tipper, and he would talk about it. He'd say, "What's $1 to you?" So he always modeled that and embodied that for us, that generosity. And so I tip generously, and I think of my dad and invoke his memory. And we can offer tea lights, incense. We can think of people again when we do specific things. When I swim, I think of my friend Elon, who was an amazing swimmer, loved the water, would swim in any body of water. And Joanne Cacciatore also, she started an amazing, it's called the Kindness Project. She actually started a foundation, the Miss Foundation. This project is part of it. And it arose from, she lost an infant daughter. She lost a baby at birth. And I think the first impulse, which gave rise to this project, was that she was in a shoe store and with her own children. She had 3 other children. and there was a family buying shoes, and they didn't have enough money to buy shoes for all of their children. And one of them seemed to be about 3 years of age, about the age that her daughter would have been. She felt this tremendous sense of grief and loss at her, thinking of her child and how she might have been there and she should have been there. And so before she left, she went to the cashier, she went to the register, and she made a generous donation for that family to buy shoes for their children. And on a slip of paper, she wrote, "In memory of Cheyenne," her child's name. And then she began, if she was at a restaurant and the people who were there had a baby and that reminded her of her baby, she would pick up their tab and leave a slip of paper that said, "In memory of Cheyenne." And she realized it was so meaningful for her to do these anonymous acts of kindness, of generosity, that they began to, she, along with people in her grief community, printed cards that just said, "In memory of," and someone would just add the name of a loved one. And now thousands of these cards have been distributed around the world. And people do remarkable, spontaneous, generous things. One woman had her baby died of SIDS when he was 4 months old, and she was in a restaurant, and clearly pregnant woman came in and was there in a gathering, and it was obvious, it was joyful, and she could hear them speaking and sharing that it was a baby shower. And she was overcome with grief. She had to fight back her own tears. And she said she had to resist the impulse to turn and say to them, "Keep your receipts. Some babies die." But she didn't do that. Instead, she got up also and she went to the maitre d' and she covered the cost of that luncheon and left a kindness project card that said, "In memory of Jared," the name of her baby. And then Joanne Cacciatore received an email later that week because the name of the Miss Foundation is on the cards. And the woman wrote in the email, "I just wanted to acknowledge a tremendous gift I received this week when I was celebrating having a baby shower. And I wanted to express, if you know who this woman is, that when my baby comes, when she gets older, I will share with her that she was visited by an angel named Jared." And so that circle was complete. So creative, remarkable ways to honor and move the love we have for our dear one out into the world. Because Joanne Cacciatore shares that as our grief heals, our grief also does. Our grief can move out in ways of love and generosity and healing. She observes a day of silence at times and has a tag that she pins on her blouse that says "Day of Silence in Memory of Cheyenne." That kind of offering that deeply touches people. And then, actually, I'll pause here. She has a whole list of remarkable practices. Element gazing, just being out in nature and watching the wind move the leaves, or sitting by a body of water, or focusing on the sensation of the wind or air against your skin. She calls that element gazing. She talks about a practice of barefoot walking. She lives in the Southwest in Sedona, Arizona. And at one point she noticed that she felt dissociated from her grief and her feelings and her experience. And she instinctively just took off her shoes to be closer to the earth. And she walked up a mountain near her home with thorns and burrs and stickers, and just slowly, carefully placing her feet, avoiding the stones, avoiding the burrs, but feeling some pain, some discomfort, feeling alive, feeling connected. And she said that she engages that as a mindful practice of presence and connection and ground. So I won't, she has talks about doing collage work, making found poetry, looking at a page of newsprint and identifying different words and highlighting them and then seeing what they might express. I'll share one more practice because it's so potent. And that is Megan Devine has started an organization called Refuge in Grief. And their work centers around writing practices. And she identified that writing was a main healing practice for her in her own traumatic loss. She said, writing the true reality of our loss helps us to survive. There's a freedom in letting all the words out. There's a freedom in being heard. On the page, everything is welcome. And one of the participants in her programs, a woman, said, writing didn't fix me. It let me begin to honor myself, my own experience, and my own broken heart.